Mumu by Ivan Turgenev, translated by Constance Garnett and narrated by Richard Williams. In one of the outlying streets of Moscow, in a grey house with white columns and a balcony warped all askew, there was once living a lady, a widow surrounded by numerous households of serfs. Her sons were in the government service at Petersburg, and her daughters were married. She went out very little, and in solitude lived through the last years of her miserly and dreary old age. Her day, a joyless and gloomy day, had long been over, but the evening of her life was blacker than night. Of all her servants, the most remarkable personage was the porter, Gerasim, a man with full 12 inches over the normal height, of heroic build, and deaf and dumb from his birth. The lady, his owner, had brought him up from the village where he lived alone in a little hut, apart from his brothers, and was reckoned about the most punctual of her peasants in the payment of the seigneurial dues. Endowed with extraordinary strength, he did the work of 4 men. Work flew apace under his hands, and it was a pleasant sight to see him when he was ploughing, while, with his huge palms pressing hard upon the plough, he seemed alone, unaided by his poor horse, to cleave the yielding bosom of the earth, or, when about St. Peter's Day, he plied his scythe with a furious energy that might have mown a young birch copse up by the roots, or swiftly and untiringly wielded a flail over 2 yards long, while the hard, oblong muscles of his shoulders rose and fell like a lever. His perpetual silence lent a solemn dignity to his unwearying labour. He was a splendid peasant, and, except for his affliction, any girl would have been glad to marry him. But now they had taken Gerasim to Moscow, bought him boots, had him made a full-skirted coat for summer, a sheepskin for winter, put into his hand a broom and a spade, and appointed him porter. At first, he intensely disliked his new mode of life. From his childhood, he had been used to field labour, to village life. Shut off by his affliction from the society of men, he had grown up dumb and mighty, as a tree grows on a fruitful soil. When he was transported to the town, he could not understand what was being done with him. He was miserable and stupefied, with the stupefaction of some strong young bull, taken straight from the meadow where the rich grass stood up to his belly, taken and put in the truck of a railway train, and there, while smoke and sparks and gusts of steams puff out upon the sturdy beast, he is whirled onwards, whirled along with loud roar and whistle, whither, God knows. What Gerasim had to do in his new duties seemed a mere trifle to him after his hard toil as a peasant. In half an hour all his work was done, and he would once more stand stock-still in the middle of the courtyard, staring open-mouthed at all the passers-by, as though trying to wrest from them the explanation of his perplexing position. Or he would suddenly go off into some corner and, flinging a long way off the broom or the spade, throw himself on his face on the ground and lie for hours without stirring, like a caged beast. But man gets used to anything, and Gerasim got used at last to living in town. He had little work to do. His whole duty consisted in keeping the courtyard clean, bringing in a barrel of water twice a day, splitting and dragging in wood for the kitchen and the house, keeping out strangers and watching at night. And it must be said, he did his duty zealously. In his courtyard there was never a shaving lying about, never a speck of dust. If, sometimes in the muddy season, the wretched nag, put under his charge for fetching water, got stuck in the road, he would simply give it a shove with his shoulder, and set not only the cart, but the horse itself moving. If he set to chopping wood, the axe fairly rang like glass, and chips and chunks flew in all directions. And as for strangers, after he had one night caught 2 thieves and knocked their heads together, knocked them so that there was not the slightest need to take them to the police station afterwards, everyone in the neighbourhood began to feel a great respect for him. Even those who came in the daytime, by no means robbers, but simply unknown persons, at the sight of the terrible porter, waved and shouted to him as though he could hear their shouts. With all the rest of the servants, Gerasim was on terms hardly friendly. They were afraid of him, but familiar. He regarded them as his fellows. They explained themselves to him by signs, and he understood them and exactly carried out all orders, but knew his own rights too. And soon no one dared to take his seat at the table. Gerasim was altogether of a strict and serious temper. He liked order in everything. Even the cocks did not dare to fight in his presence, or woe betide them. Directly he caught sight of them, he would seize them by the legs, swing them 10 times round in the air like a wheel, and throw them in different directions. There were geese, too, kept in the yard, but the goose, as is well known, is a dignified and reasonable bird. Gerasim felt a respect for them, looked after them and fed them. He was himself not unlike a gander of the steppes. He was assigned a little garret over the kitchen. He arranged it himself to his own liking, made a bedstead in it of oak boards on 4 stumps of wood for legs, a truly titanic bedstead. One might have put a ton or 2 on it. It would not have bent under the load. Under the bed was a solid chest, and in a corner stood a little table of the same strong kind, and near the table a 3-legged stool, so solid and squat that Gerasim himself would sometimes pick it up and drop it again with a smile of delight. The garret was locked up by means of a padlock that looked like a kalach or basket-shaped loaf, only black. The key of this padlock Gerasim always carried about him in his girdle. He did not like people to come to his garret. So passed a year, at the end of which a little incident befell Gerasim. The old lady, in whose service he lived as a porter, adhered in everything to the ancient ways and kept a large number of servants. In her house were not only laundresses, sempstresses, carpenters, tailors and tailoresses, there was even a harness-maker. He was reckoned as a veterinary surgeon too, and a doctor for the servants. There was a household doctor for the mistress, and there was lastly a shoemaker, by the name Kapiton Klimev, a sad drunkard. Klimov regarded himself as an injured creature, whose merits were unappreciated, a cultivated man from Petersburg, who ought not to be living in Moscow without occupation, in the wilds, so to speak, and if he drank, as he himself expressed it emphatically, with a blow on his chest, it was sorrow drove him to it. So one day his mistress had a conversation about him with her head steward, Gavria, a man whom, judging solely from his little yellow eyes and nose like a duck's beak, fate itself, it seemed, had marked out as a person in authority. The lady expressed her regret at the corruption of the morals of Kapiton, who had only the evening before been picked up somewhere in the street. "Now, Gravir," she observed all of a sudden, "now, if we were to marry him, what do you think? Perhaps he would be steadier?" "Why not marry him indeed, He could be married, answered Gravir, "and it would be a very good thing to be sure, "Yes, only who is to marry him?" "I, but that's at your pleasure, He may, anyway, so to say, be wanted for something. He can't be turned adrift altogether." "I fancy he likes Tatiana." Gravir was on the point of making some reply, but he shut his lips tightly. "Yes, let him marry Tatiana," the lady decided, taking a pinch of snuff complacently. "Do you hear?" "Yes, Gavria articulated, and he withdrew. Returning to his own room, it was in a little lodge, and was almost filled up with metal-bound trunks. Gavria first sent his wife away, and then sat down at the window and pondered. His mistress's unexpected arrangement had clearly put him in a difficulty. At last he got up and sent to call Kapiton. Kapiton made his appearance. But before reporting their conversation to the reader, we considered it not out of place to relate in a few words who was this Tatiana, whom it was to be Kapiton's lot to marry, and why the great lady's order had disturbed the steward. Tatiana, one of the laundresses referred to above, as a trained and skilful laundress, she was in charge of the fine linen only, was a woman of 28, thin, fair-haired, with moles on her left cheek. Moles on the left cheek are regarded as of evil omen in Russia, a token of unhappy life. Tatiana could not boast of her good luck. From her earliest youth she had been badly treated. She had done the work of two, and had never known affection. She had been poorly clothed, and had once received the smallest wages. Relations she had practically none. An uncle, she had once had a butler left behind in the country as useless, and other uncles of hers were peasants. That was all. At one time she had passed for a beauty, but her good looks were very soon over. In disposition she was very meek, or rather scared towards herself. She felt perfect indifference of others. She stood in mortal dread. She thought of nothing but how to get her work done in good time, never talked to anyone, and trembled at the very name of her mistress, though the latter scarcely knew her by sight. When Gerasim was brought from the country, she was ready to die with fear on seeing his huge figure, tried all she could to avoid meeting him, even dropped her eyelids when sometimes she had chanced to run past him, hurrying from the house to the laundry. Gerasim at first paid no special attention to her. Then he used to smile when she came his way. Then he began even to stare admiringly at her, and at last he never took his eyes off her. She took his fancy, whether by the mild expression of her face or the timidity of her movements, who can tell? So one day she was stealing across the yard, with a starched dressing jacket of her mistress's carefully poised on her outspread fingers. Someone suddenly grasped her vigorously by the elbow. She turned round and fairly screamed. Behind her stood Gerasim. With a foolish smile, making inarticulate, caressing grunts, he held out to her a gingerbread cock with gold tinsel on his tail and wings. She was about to refuse it, but he thrust it forcibly into her hand, shook his head, walked away, and turning around, once more grunted something very affectionately to her. From that day forward he gave her no peace. Wherever she went, he was on the spot at once, coming to meet her, smiling, grunting, waving his hands. All at once he would pull a ribbon out of the bosom of his smock and put it in her hand, or would sweep the dust out of her way. The poor girl simply did not know how to behave or what to do. Soon the whole household knew of the dumb porter's wiles. Jeers, jokes, sly hints were showered upon Tatiana. At Gerasim, however, it was not everyone who would dare scoff. He did not like jokes. Indeed, in his presence she too was left in peace. Whether she liked it or not, the girl found herself to be under his protection. Like all deaf-mutes, he was very suspicious, and very readily perceived when they were laughing at him or at her. One day, at dinner, the wardrobe-keeper, Tatiana's superior, fell to nagging, as it is called, at her, and brought the poor thing to such a state that she did not know where to look, and was almost crying with vexation. Gerasim got up all of a sudden, stretched out his gigantic hand, laid it on the wardrobe-maid's head, and looked into her face with such grim ferocity that her head positively flopped upon the table. Everyone was still. Gerasim took up his spoon again, and went on with his cabbage soup. "Look at him, the dumb devil, the wood demon," they all muttered in undertones, while the wardrobe-maid got up and went into the maid's room. Another time, noticing that Capiton, the same Capiton who was the subject of the conversation reported above, was gossiping somewhat too attentively with Tatiana, Gerasim beckoned him to him, led him into the cart-shed, and taking up a shaft that was standing in a corner by one end, lightly, but most significantly, menaced him with it. Since then, no one addressed a word to Tatiana, and all this cost him nothing. It is true the wardrobe-maid, as soon as she reached the maid's room, promptly fell into a fainting fit, and behaved altogether so skilfully that Gerasim's rough action reached his mistress's knowledge the same day. But the capricious old lady only laughed, and several times, to the great offence of the wardrobe-maid, forced her to repeat how he bent your head down with his heavy hand, and next day she sent Gerasim a rouble. She looked on him with favour as a strong and faithful watchman. Gerasim stood in considerable awe of her, but all the same he had hopes of her favour, and was preparing to go to her with a petition for leave to marry Tatiana. He was only waiting for a new coat, promised him by the steward, to present a proper appearance before his mistress, when this same mistress suddenly took it into her head to marry Tatiana to Capiton. The reader will now readily understand the perturbation of mind that overtook the steward Gravier after his conversation with his mistress. "My lady," he thought, as he sat at the window, "favours Gerasim, to be sure." Gavrier was well aware of this, and that was why he himself looked on him with an indulgent eye. Still, he is a speechless creature. I could not, indeed, put it before the mistress that Gerasim's courting Tatiana, but after all it's true enough. He's a queer sort of husband. But on the other hand, that devil, God forgive me, has only got to find out that they're marrying Tatiana to Capiton. He'll smash up everything in the house, 'pon my soul. There's no reasoning with him. Why, he's such a devil, God forgive my sins, there's no getting over him nohow, 'pon my soul. Capiton's entrance broke the thread of Gravier's reflections. The dissipated shoemaker came in, his hands behind him, and lounging carelessly against a projecting angle of the wall near the door, crossed his right foot in front of his left, and tossed his head as much as to say, "What do you want?" Gavrier looked at Capiton, and drummed with his fingers on the window frame. Capiton merely screwed up his leaden eyes a little, but he did not look down. He even grinned slightly, and passed his hand over his whitish locks which were sticking up in all directions. "Well, here I am. What is it?" "You're a pretty fellow," said Gravier, and paused. "A pretty fellow you are, there's no denying." Capiton only twitched his little shoulders. "Are you any better, pray?" he thought to himself. "Just look at yourself now, look at yourself," Gravier went on reproachfully. "Now, whatever do you look like?" Capiton serenely surveyed his shabby, tattered coat and his patched trousers, and with special attention stared at his burst boots, especially the one on the tiptoe of which his right foot so gracefully poised, and he fixed his eyes again on the steward. "Well?" "Well," repeated Gravier. "Well, and then you say well? You look like old Nick himself. God forgive my saying so, that's what you look like." Capiton blinked rapidly. "Go on abusing me. Go on, if you like, Gavrier Andrech," he thought to himself again. "Here you've been drunk again," Gavrier began. "Drunk again, haven't you, eh? Come, answer me." "Owing to the weakness of my health, I have exposed myself to spirituous beverages, certainly," replied Capiton. "Owing to the weakness of your health. They let you off too easy, that's what it is, and you've been apprenticed in Petersburg. Much you learned in your apprenticeship. You simply eat your bread in idleness. In that matter, Gavrier Andrech, there is one to judge me, the Lord God himself, and no one else. He also knows what manner of man I be in this world, and whether I eat my bread in idleness. And as concerning your contention regarding drunkenness, in that matter too I am not to blame, but rather a friend. He led me into temptation, but was diplomatic, and got away, while you were left like a goose in the street. Ah, you're a dissolute fellow. But that's not the point," the steward went on. "I've something to tell you. Our Lady—" Here he paused a minute. "It's Our Lady's pleasure that you should be married. Do you hear? She imagines you may be steadier when you're married. Do you understand?" "To be sure, I do." "Well then, for my part I think it would be better to give you a good hiding, but there, it's her business. Well, are you agreeable?" Capiton grinned. "Matrimony is an excellent thing for anyone, Gavrier Andrech, and as far as I am concerned, I shall be quite agreeable." "Very well then," replied Gavrier, while he reflected to himself. "There's no denying the man expresses himself very properly. Only there's one thing," he pursued aloud. "The wife Our Lady's picked out for you is an unlucky choice." "Why, who is she, permit me to inquire?" "Tatiana." "Tatiana!" And Capiton opened his eyes and moved a little away from the wall. "Well, What are you in such a taking for? Isn't she to your taste, hey? Not to my taste, you say, Gavrila Andreich? She's right enough, a hard-working, steady girl. But you know very well yourself, Gavrila Andreich, why that fellow, that wild man of the woods, that monster of the steppes, he's after her, you know. I know, mate. I know all about it. The butler cut him short in a tone of annoyance. But there, you see. But upon my soul, Gavrila Andreich, why, he'll kill me. By God, he will. He'll crush me like some fly. Why, he's got a fist. Why, you kindly look yourself what a fist he's got. Why, he's simply got a fist like Minin Pozharsky's. You see, he's deaf. He beats and does not hear how he's beating. He swings his graced fists as if he's asleep. And then there's no possibility of pacifying him. And for why? Why, because as you know yourself, Gavrila Andreich, he's deaf, and what's more, has no more wit than the heel of my foot. Why, he's a sort of beast, a heathen idol, Gavrila Andreich, and worse, a block of wood. What have I done that I should have to suffer from him now? Sure it is. It's all over me now. I've knocked about. I've had enough to put up with. I've been battered like an earthenware pot, but I'm still a man after all, and not a worthless pot. I know. Don't go talking away. Lord, my God, the shoemaker continued warmly. When is the end? When, oh Lord? A poor wretch I am. A poor wretch whose sufferings are endless. What a life. What a life mine's been, come to think of it. In my young days, I was beaten by a German I was prenticed to. In the prime of my life, beaten by my own countrymen. And last of all, in ripe years, see what I've been brought to. Oh, you flabby soul, said Gavrila Andreich. Why do you make so many words about it? Why do you say, Gavrila Andreich? It's not a beating I'm afraid of, Gavrila Andreich. A gentleman may chastise me in private, but give me a civil word before folks, and I'm a man still. But see now, whom I've to do with. Come, get along, Gavrila interposed impatiently. Capiton turned away and staggered off. But if it were not for him, the steward shouted after him, you would consent for your part? I signify my acquiescence, retorted Capiton as he disappeared. His fine language did not desert him, even in the most trying positions. The steward walked several times up and down the room. Well, call Tatiana now, he said at last. A few instants later, Tatiana had come up almost noiselessly and was standing in the doorway. What are your orders, Gavrila Andreich? She said in a soft voice. The steward looked at her intently. Well, Tanyusha, he said, would you like to be married? Our lady has chosen a husband for you. Yes, Gavrila Andreich. And whom has she designed to name as a husband for me? She added falteringly. Capiton, the shoemaker. Yes, sir. He's a feather-brained fellow, that's certain, but it's just for that the mistress reckons upon you. Yes, sir. There's one difficulty. You know the deaf man, Gerasim, he's courting you, you see. How did you come to bewitch such a bear? But you see, he'll kill you, very like, he's such a bear. He'll kill me, Gavrila Andreich, he'll kill me, and no mistake. Kill you? Well, we shall see about that. What do you mean by saying he'll kill you? Has he any right to kill you? Tell me yourself. I don't know, Gavrila Andreich, about his having any right or not. What a woman! Why, you've made him no promise, I suppose. What are you pleased to ask of me? The steward was silent for a little, thinking. You're a meek soul. Well, that's right, he said aloud. We'll have another talk with you later. Now, you can go, Tanyusha. I see you're not unruly, certainly. Tatiana turned, steadied herself a little against the doorpost, and went away. And perhaps Our Lady will forget all about this wedding by tomorrow, thought the steward. And here am I, worrying myself for nothing. As for that insolent fellow, we must tie him down if it comes to that. We must let the police know. Ustnya Fedorovna, he shouted in a loud voice to his wife, heat the samovar, my good soul. All that day Tatiana hardly went out of the laundry. At first she had started crying, then she wiped away her tears and set to work as before. Kapiton stayed till late at night at the gin shop with a friend of his, a man of gloomy appearance, to whom he related in detail how he used to live in Petersburg with a gentleman, who would have been all right, except he was a bit too strict, and he had a slight weakness besides. He was too fond of drink, and, as to the fair sex, he didn't stick at anything. His gloomy companion merely said yes, but when Kapiton announced at last that, in a certain event, he would have to lay hands on himself tomorrow, his gloomy companion remarked that it was bedtime, and they parted in surly silence. Meanwhile, the steward's anticipations were not fulfilled. The old lady was so much taken up with the idea of Kapiton's wedding that even in the night she talked of nothing else to one of her companions, who was kept in her house solely to entertain her in case of sleeplessness, and, like a night cabman, slept in the day. When Gavria came to her after morning tea with his report, her first question was, "And how about our wedding? Is it getting on all right?" He replied, of course, that it was getting on first rate, and that Kapiton would appear before her to pay his reverence to her that day. The old lady was not quite well. She did not give much time to business. The steward went back to his own room and called a council. The matter certainly called for serious consideration. Tatiana would make no difficulty, of course, but Kapiton had declared in the hearing that all he had but one head to lose, not 2 or 3. Gerasim turned rapid sullen looks on everyone, would not budge from the steps of the maids' quarters, and seemed to guess that some mischief was being hatched against him. They met together. Among them was an old sideboard waiter nicknamed Uncle Tail, to whom everyone looked respectfully for counsel, though all they got out of him was, "Here's a pretty pass, to be sure, to be sure, to be sure." As a preliminary measure of security, to provide against contingencies, they locked Kapiton up in the lumber room where the filter was kept, then considered the question with the gravest deliberation. It would, to be sure, be easy to have recourse to force. But heaven save us! There would be an uproar. The mistress would be put out. It would be awful. What should they do? They thought, and at last thought out a solution. It had many a time been observed that Gerasim could not bear drunkards. As he sat at the gates, he would always turn away with disgust when someone passed by intoxicated, with unsteady steps and his cap on one side of his ear. They resolved that Tatiana should be instructed to pretend to be tipsy, and should pass by Gerasim staggering and reeling about. The poor girl refused for a long while to agree to this, but they persuaded her at last. She saw, too, that it was the only possible way of getting rid of her adorer. She went out. Kapiton was released from the lumber room, for, after all, he had an interest in the affair. Gerasim was sitting on the curbstone at the gate, scraping the ground with a spade. From behind every corner, from behind every window blind, the others were watching him. The trick succeeded beyond all expectations. On seeing Tatiana, at first he nodded as usual, making caressing, inarticulate sounds. Then he looked carefully at her, dropped his spade, jumped up, went up to her, brought his face close to her face. In her fright, she staggered more than ever and shut her eyes. He took her by the arm, whirled her right across the yard, and going into the room where the council had been sitting, pushed her straight at Kapiton. Tatiana fairly swooned away. Gerasim stood, looked at her, waved his hand, laughed, and went off, stepping heavily to his garret. For the next 24 hours, he did not come out of it. The postilion Antipka said afterwards that he saw Gerasim through a crack in the wall, sitting on his bedstead, his face in his hand. From time to time he uttered soft, regular sounds. He was wailing a dirge, that is, swaying backwards and forwards with his eyes shut and shaking his head as drivers or bargemen do when they chant their melancholy songs. Antipka could not bear it, and he came away from the crack. When Gerasim came out of the garret next day, no particular change could be observed in him. He only seemed, as it were, more morose, and took not the slightest notice of Tatiana or Kapiton. The same evening, they both had to appear before their mistress with geese under their arms, and in a week's time they were married. Even on the day of the wedding, Gerasim showed no change of any sort in his behaviour. Only, he came back from the river without water. He had somehow broken the barrel on the road, and at night in the stable he washed and rubbed down his horse so vigorously it swayed like a blade of grass in the wind and staggered from one leg to the other under his fists of iron. All this had taken place in the spring. Another year passed by, during which Kapiton became a hopeless drunkard, and as being absolutely of no use for anything, was sent away with the store wagons to a distant village with his wife. On the day of his departure, he put a very good face on it at first, and declared that he would always be at home, send him where they would, even to the other end of the world. But later on, he lost heart, began grumbling that he was being taken to uneducated people, and collapsed so completely at last that he could not even put his own hat on. Some charitable soul stuck it on his forehead, set the peak straight in front, and thrust it on with a slap from above. When everything was quite ready, and the peasants already held the rein in their hands, and were only waiting for the words, "with God's blessing," to start, Gerasim came out of his garret, went up to Tatiana, and gave her as a parting present a red cotton handkerchief he had bought for her a year ago. Tatiana, who had up to that instant borne all the revolting details of her life with great indifference, could not control herself upon that. She burst into tears, and as she took her seat in the cart, she kissed Gerasim 3 times like a good Christian. He meant to accompany her as far as the town barrier, and did walk beside her cart for a while, but he suddenly stopped at the Crimean ford, waved his hand, and walked away along the riverside. It was getting towards evening. He walked slowly, watching the water. All of a sudden, he fancied something was floundering in the mud close to the bank. He stooped over and saw a little white and black puppy who, in spite of all its efforts, could not get out of the water. It was struggling, slipping back and trembling all over its thin, wet little body. Gerasim looked at the unlucky little dog, picked it up with one hand, put it into the bosom of his coat, and hurried with long steps homewards. He went into his garret, put the rescued puppy on his bed, covered it with his thick overcoat, ran first to the table for straw, and then to the kitchen for a cup of milk. Carefully folding back the overcoat and spreading out the straw, he set the milk on the bedstead. The poor little puppy was not more than 3 weeks old. Its eyes were just open. One eye still seemed rather larger than the other. It did not know how to lap out of a cup, and did nothing but shiver and blink. Gerasim took hold of its head softly with 2 fingers, and dipped its little nose into the milk. The pup suddenly began lapping greedily, sniffing, shaking itself, and choking. Gerasim watched and watched it, and all at once he laughed outright. All night long he was waiting on it, keeping it covered and rubbing it dry. He fell asleep himself at last, and slept quietly and happily by its side. No mother could have looked after her baby as Gerasim looked after his little nursling. At first she, for the pup turned out to be a bitch, was very weak, feeble and ugly, but by degrees she grew stronger and improved in looks, and thanks to the unflagging care of her preserver, in 8 months' time she was transformed into a very pretty dog of the spaniel breed, with long ears, a bushy spiral tail, and large, expressive eyes. She was devotedly attached to Gerasim, and was never a yard from his side. She always followed him about, wagging her tail. He had given her a name. The dumb know that their inarticulate noises call the attention of others. He called her Mumu. All the servants in the house liked her, and called her Mumu too. She was very intelligent, she was friendly with everyone, but was only fond of Gerasim. Gerasim, on his side, loved her passionately, and he did not like it when other people stroked her, whether he was afraid of her or jealous, God knows. She used to wake him up in the morning, pulling at his coat. She used to take the reins in her mouth and bring him up the old horse that carried the water, with whom she was on very friendly terms. With a face of great importance, she used to go with him to the river. She used to watch his brooms and spades, and never allowed anyone to go into his garret. He cut a little hole in his door on purpose for her, and she seemed to feel that only in Gerasim's garret she was completely mistress and at home, and directly she went in, she used to jump with a satisfied air upon the bed. At night she did not sleep at all, but she never barked without sufficient cause, like some stupid house-dog who, sitting on its hind legs, blinking with its nose in the air, barks simply from dullness at the stars, usually 3 times in succession. No, Mumu's delicate little voice was never raised without good reason. Either some strangling was passing close to the fence, or there was some suspicious round or rustle somewhere. In fact, she was an excellent watchdog. It is true that there was another dog in the yard, a tawny old dog with brown spots called Wolf, but he was never, even at night, let off the chain. And indeed he was so decrepit that he did not even wish for freedom. He used to lie curled up in his kennel, and only rarely uttered a sleepy, almost noiseless bark, which broke off at once, as though he were himself aware of its uselessness. Mumu never went into the mistress's house, and when Gerasim carried wood into the rooms, she always stayed behind, impatiently waiting for him at the steps, pricking up her ears and turning her head to right and to left at the slightest creak of the door. So passed another year. Gerasim went on performing his duties as house-porter, and was very well content with his lot, when suddenly an unexpected incident occurred. One fine summer day, the old lady was walking up and down the drawing-room with her dependents. She was in high spirits. She laughed and made jokes. Her servile companions laughed and joked too, but they did not feel particularly mirthful. The household did not much like it when the mistress was in a lively mood, for, to begin with, she expected from everyone prompt and complete participation in her merriment, and was furious if anyone showed a face that did not beam with delight, and secondly, these outbursts never lasted long with her, and were usually followed by a sour and gloomy mood. That day she got up in a lucky hour. At cards she took the 4 knaves, which means the fulfilment of one's wishes. She used to try her fortune on the cards every morning, and her tea struck her as particularly delicious, for which her maid was rewarded by words of praise, and by 2 pence in money. With a sweet smile on her wrinkled lips, the lady walked about the drawing-room and went up to the window. A flower garden had been laid out before the window, and in the very middle bed, under a rose-bush, lay Mumu, busily gnawing a bone. The lady caught sight of her. "Mercy on us!" she cried suddenly. "What dog is that?" The companion addressed by the old lady hesitated, poor thing, in that wretched state of uneasiness which is common in any person in a dependent position who doesn't know very well what significance to give to the exclamation of a superior. "I don't know," she faltered. "I fancy it's the dumb man's dog." "Mercy," the lady cut her short, "but it's a charming little dog. Order it to be brought in. Has he had it long? How is it I've never seen it before? Order it to be brought in." The companion flew at once into the hall. "Boy, boy," she shouted, "bring Mumu in at once. She's in the flower garden." "Her name's Mumu, then," observed the lady. "A very nice name." "Oh, very indeed," chimed in the companion. "Make haste, Stepan." Stepan, a sturdy-built young fellow, whose duties were those of a footman, rushed headlong into the flower garden and tried to capture Mumu, but she cleverly slipped from his fingers, and with her tail in the air fled full speed to Gerasim, who was at that instant in the kitchen, knocking out and cleaning a barrel, turning it upside down in his hands like a child's drum. Stepan ran after her, and tried to catch her just at her master's feet, but the sensible dog would not let a stranger touch her, and with a bound she got away. Gerasim looked on with a smile at all this ado. At last Stepan got up, much amazed, and hurriedly explained by signs that the mistress wanted the dog brought in to her. Gerasim was a little astonished. He called Mumu, however, picked her up, and handed her over to Stepan. Stepan carried her into the drawing-room and put her down on the parquet floor. The old lady began calling the dog in her coaxing voice. Mumu, who had never in her life been in such magnificent apartments, was very much frightened, and made a rush for the door, but being driven back by the obsequious Stepan, she began trembling and huddled close up against the wall. "Mumu, Mumu, come to me, come to your mistress," said the lady. "Come, silly thing, don't be afraid." "Come, Mumu, come to the mistress," repeated the companions. "Come along." But Mumu looked round her uneasily and did not stir. "Bring her something to eat," said the old lady. "How stupid she is! She won't come to her mistress. What's she afraid of?" "She's not used to your honour yet," ventured one of the companions in a timid and conciliatory voice. Stepan brought in a saucer of milk and set it down before Mumu, but Mumu would not even sniff at the milk, and still shivered and looked round as before. "Ah, what a silly you are," said the lady, and going up to her, she stooped down and was about to stroke her, but Mumu turned her head abruptly and showed her teeth. The lady hurriedly drew back her hand. A momentary silence followed. Mumu gave a faint whine, as though she would complain and apologize. The old lady moved back, scowling. The dog's sudden movement had frightened her. "Oh!" shrieked all the companions at once. "She's not bitten you, has she? Heaven forbid!" Mumu had never bitten anyone in her life. "Oh! Ah!" "Take her away," said the old lady in a changed voice. "Wretched little dog! What a spiteful creature!" And turning round deliberately, she went towards her boudoir. Her companions looked timidly at one another, and were about to follow her, but she stopped, stared coldly at them, and said, "What's that for, pray? I have not called you," and went out. The companions waved their hands to Stepan in despair. He picked up Mumu and flung her promptly outside the door, just at Gerasim's feet, and half an hour later a profound stillness led in the house, and the old lady sat on her sofa looking blacker than a thundercloud. What trifles, if you think of it, will sometimes disturb anyone. Till evening the lady was out of humour. She did not want to talk to anyone, did not play cards, and passed a bad night. She fancied the eau de cologne that they gave her was not the same as she usually had, and that her pillow smelt of soap, and she made the wardrobe maid smell all the bed linen. In fact, she was very upset and cross altogether. Next morning she ordered Gravir to be summoned an hour earlier than usually. "Tell me, please," she began, directly the latter, not without some inward trepidation, crossed the threshold of her boudoir. "What dog was that barking all night in our yard? It wouldn't let me sleep." "A dog, What dog, Maybe the man's dog, he brought out in a rather unsteady voice. "I don't know whether it was the dumb man's or whose, but it wouldn't let me sleep. And I wonder what we have such a lot of dogs for. I wish to know. We have a yard dog, haven't we?" "Oh, yes, we have, Wolf, "Well, why more? What do we want more dogs for? It's simply introducing disorder. There's no one in control in the house, that's what it is. And what does the dumb man want with the dog? Who gave him leave to keep dogs in my yard? Yesterday I went to the window, and there it was lying in the flower garden. It had dragged in nastiness it was gnawing, and my roses are planted there." The lady ceased. "Let her be gone from today. Do you hear?" "Yes, Today. Now go. I will send for you later for the report." Gavria went away. As he went through the drawing-room, the steward, by way of maintaining order, moved a bell from one table to another. He stealthily blew his duck-like nose in the hall, and went into the outer hall. In the outer hall, on a locker, was Stepan, asleep in the attitude of a slain warrior in a battalion picture, his bare legs thrust out below the coat which served him for a blanket. The steward gave him a shove and whispered some instructions to him, to which Stepan responded with something between a yawn and a laugh. The steward went away, and Stepan got up, put on his coat and his boots, went out and stood on the steps. 5 minutes had not passed before Gerasim made his appearance with a huge bundle of hewn logs on his back, accompanied by the inseparable Mumu. The lady had given orders that her bedroom and boudoir should be heated at times, even in the summer. Gerasim turned sideways before the door, shoved it open with his shoulder, and staggered into the house with his load. Mumu, as usual, stayed behind to wait for him. Then Stepan, seizing his chance, suddenly pounced on her like a kite on a chicken, held her down to the ground, gathered her up in his arms, and without even putting on his cap, ran out of the yard with her, got into the first fly he met, and galloped off to a marketplace. There he soon found a purchaser, to whom he sold her for a shilling, on condition that he would keep her for at least a week tied up. Then he returned at once. But before he got home, he got off the fly and, going right round the yard, jumped over the fence into the yard from a back street. He was afraid to go in at the gate for fear of meeting Gerasim. His anxiety was unnecessary, however. Gerasim was no longer in the yard. On coming out of the house, he had at once missed Mumu. He never remembered her failing to wait for his return, and began running up and down looking for her and calling her in his own way. He rushed up to his garret, up to the hayloft, ran out into the street, this way and that. She was lost! He turned to the other serfs, with the most despairing signs, questioned them about her, pointing to her height from the ground, describing her with his hands. Some of them really did not know what had become of Mumu, and merely shook their heads. Others did know, and smiled to him for all response, while the steward assumed an important air, and began scolding the coachman. Then Gerasim ran right away out of the yard. It was dark by the time he came back. From his worn-out look, his unsteady walk, and his dusty clothes, it might be surmised that he had been running over half Moscow. He stood still opposite the window of the mistress's house, took a searching look at the steps where a group of house serfs were crowded together, turned away and uttered once more his inarticulate Mumu. Mumu did not answer. He went away. Everyone looked after him, but no one smiled or said a word, and the inquisitive postulant Antipka reported next morning in the kitchen that the dumb man had been groaning all night. All the next day, Gerasim did not show himself, so that they were obliged to send the coachman Potap for water instead of him, at which the coachman Potap was anything but pleased. The lady asked Gravia if her orders had been carried out. Gravia replied that they had. The next morning, Gerasim came out of his garret and went about his work. He came in to his dinner, ate it, and went out again, without a greeting to anyone. His face, which had always been lifeless, as with all deaf mutes, seemed now to be turned to stone. After dinner he went out of the yard again, but not for long. He came back and went straight up to the hayloft. Night came on, a clear moonlight night. Gerasim lay breathing heavily and incessantly turning from side to side. Suddenly he felt something pull at the skirt of his coat. He started, but did not raise his head, and even shut his eyes tighter. But again there was a pull, stronger than before, and he jumped up before him. With an end of string round her neck was Mumu, twisting and turning. A prolonged cry of delight broke from his speechless breast. He caught up Mumu and hugged her tight in his arms. She licked his nose and eyes, and beard and moustache all in one instant. He stood a little, thought a minute, crept cautiously down from the hayloft, looked round, and having satisfied that no one could see him, made his way successfully to his garret. Gerasim had guessed before that his dog had not got lost by her own doing, that she must have been taken away by the mistress's orders. The servants had explained to him by signs that his Mumu had snapped at her, and he determined to take his own measures. First, he fed Mumu with a bit of bread, fondled her and put her to bed. Then he fell to meditating and spent the whole night long in meditating how he could best conceal her. At last, he decided to leave her all day in the garret and only to come in now and then to see her and to take her out at night. The hole in the door he stopped up effectually with his old overcoat, and almost before it was light he was already in the yard as though nothing had happened. Even innocent guile, the same expression of melancholy in his face. It did not even occur to the poor deaf man that Mumu would betray herself by her whining. In reality, everyone in the house was soon aware that the dumb man's dog had come back and was locked up in his garret, but from sympathy with him and with her, and partly, perhaps, from dread of him, they did not let him know that they had found out his secret. The steward scratched his head and gave a despairing wave of his head, as much as to say, "Well, well, God have mercy on him, if only it doesn't come to the mistress's ears." But the dumb man had never shown such energy as on that day. He cleaned and scraped the whole courtyard, pulled up every single weed with his own hand, tugged up every stake in the fence of the flower garden to satisfy himself they were strong enough, and unaided drove them in again. In fact, he toiled and laboured so that even the old lady noticed his zeal. Twice in the course of the day, Gerasim went stealthily in to see his prisoner. When night came on, he lay down to sleep with her in the garret, not in the hayloft, and only at 2 o'clock in the night he went out to take her a turn in the fresh air. After walking about the courtyard a good while with her, he was just turning back when suddenly a rustle was heard behind the fence on the side of the back street. Mumu pricked up her ears, growled, went up to the fence, sniffed, and gave vent to a loud, shrill bark. Some drunkard had thought fit to take refuge under the fence for the night. At that very time the old lady had just fallen asleep after a prolonged fit of nervous agitation. These fits of agitation always took her after too hearty a supper. The sudden bark waked her up, her heart palpitated, and she felt faint. "Girls! Girls!" she moaned. "Girls!" The terrified maids ran into her bedroom. Oh, I am dying," she said, flinging her arms about in her agitation. "Again that dog! Again! Oh, send for the doctor. They mean to be the death of me. The dog again! Oh!" And she let her head fall back, which always signified a swoon. They rushed for the doctor, that is, for the household physician, Harriton. This doctor, whose whole qualification consisted in wearing soft-soled boots, knew how to feel the pulse delicately. He used to sleep 14 hours out of the 24, but the rest of the time he was always sighing and continually dosing the old lady with cherry bay drops. This doctor ran up at once, fumigated the room with burnt feathers, and when the old lady opened her eyes, promptly offered her a wine-glass of the hallowed drops on a silver tray. The old lady took them, and began at once in a tearful voice complaining of the dog, of Gravir, and of her fate, declaring that she was a poor old woman, and that everyone had forsaken her, no one pitied her, everyone wished her dead. Meanwhile, the luckless Mumu had gone on barking, while Gerasim tried in vain to call her away from the fence. There again," groaned the old lady, and once more she turned up the whites of her eyes. The doctor whispered to a maid. She rushed into the outer hall and shook Stepan. He ran to wake Gavrir. Gavrir, in a fury, ordered the whole household to get up. Gerasim turned round, saw lights and shadows moving in the windows, and, with an instinct of coming trouble in his heart, put Mumu under his arm, ran into his garret and locked himself in. A few minutes later, 5 men were banging at his door, but feeling the resistance of the bolt, they stopped. Gavrir ran up in a fearful state of mind, and ordered them all to wait there and watch till morning. Then he flew off himself to the maid's quarter, and through an old companion, Lyubov Libimovna, with whose assistance he used to steal tea, sugar, and other groceries, and to falsify the accounts, sent word to the mistress that the dog had unhappily run back from somewhere, but that tomorrow she should be killed, and would the mistress be so gracious as to not be angry and to overlook it? The old lady would probably not have been so appeased, but the doctor had in his haste given her fully 40 drops instead of 12. The strong dose of a narcotic acted. In a quarter of an hour, the old lady was in a sound and peaceful sleep, while Gerasim was lying with a white face on his bed, holding Mumu's mouth tightly shut. Next morning, the lady woke up rather late. Gavria was waiting till she should be awake to give the order for a final assault on Gerasim's stronghold, while he prepared himself to face a fearful storm. But the storm did not come off. The old lady lay in bed and sent for the eldest of her dependent companions. "Libov Libimovna," she began in a subdued, weak voice. She was fond of playing the part of an oppressed and forsaken victim. Needless to say, everyone in the house was made extremely uncomfortable at such times. "Libov Libimovna, you see my position. Go, my love, to Gavrila Andreich and talk to him a little. Can he really prize some wretched cur above the repose, the very life of his mistress? I could not bear to think so," she added, with an expression of deep feeling. "Go, my love, be so good as to go to Gavrila Andreich for me." Libov Libimovna was sent to Gavrila's room. What conversation passed between them is not known, but a short time after, a whole crowd of people was moving across the yard in the direction of Gerasim's garret. Gavrila walked in front, holding his cap on with his hand, though there was no wind. The footmen and cooks were close behind him. Uncle Tail was looking out of a window, giving instructions, that is to say, simply waving his hands. At the rear, there was a crowd of small boys skipping and hopping along. Half of them were outsiders who had run up. On the narrow staircase leading to the garret sat one guard. At the door were standing 2 more with sticks. They began to mount the stairs, which they entirely blocked up. Gavrila went up to the door, knocked with his fist, shouting, "Open the door!" A stifled bark was audible, but there was no answer. "Open the door, I tell you," he repeated. "But Gavrila Andreich," Stepan observed from below. "He's deaf, you know. He doesn't hear." They all laughed. "What are we to do?" Gavrila joined from above. "Why, there's a hole there in the door. So you shake the stick in there." Gavrila bent down. "He stuffed it with a coat or something. Well, you just push the coat in." At this moment a smothered bark was heard again. See, she speaks for herself," was remarked in the crowd, and again they laughed. Gavrila scratched his ear. "No, mate," he responded at last. "You can poke the coat in yourself if you like." "All right, let me." And Stepan scrambled up, took the stick, pushed in the coat and began waving the stick about in the opening, saying, "Come out, come out!" As he did so, he was still waving the stick, when suddenly the door of the garret was flung open. All the crowd flew pell-mell down the stairs instantly, Gavrila first of all. Uncle Tail locked the window. "Come, come, come," shouted Gavrila from the yard. "Mind what you're about." Gerasim stood without stirring in his doorway. The crowd gathered at the foot of the stairs. Gerasim, with his arms akimbo, looked down at all these poor creatures in German coats. In his red peasant's shirt he looked like a giant before them. Gavrila took a step forward. "Mine, mate," said he, "don't be insolent." And he began to explain to him by signs that the mistress insists on having his dog, and that he must hand it over at once, or it would be the worse for him. Gerasim looked at him, pointed to the dog, made a motion with his hand round his neck as though he were pulling a noose tight, and glanced with a face of inquiry at the steward. "Yes, yes," the latter assented, nodding. "Yes, just so." Gerasim dropped his eyes, then all of a sudden roused himself and pointed to Mumu, who was all the while standing beside him, innocently wagging her tail and pricking up her ears inquisitively. Then he repeated the strangling action round his neck, and significantly struck himself on the breast, as though announcing he would take upon himself the task of killing Mumu. "But you will deceive us," Gavrila waved back in response. Gerasim looked at him, smiled scornfully, struck himself again on the breast, and slammed the door. They looked at one another in silence. "What does that mean?" Gavrir began. "He's locked himself in." "Let him be, Gavrir Andrech," Stepan advised. "He'll do it if he's promised. He's like that, you know. If he makes a promise, it's a certain thing. He's not like us others in that. The truth's with him." "Yes, indeed." "Yes," they all repeated, nodding their heads. "Yes, that's so, yes." Uncle Tail opened his window, and he too said yes. "Well, maybe. We shall see," responded Gavrir. "Anyway, we won't take off the guard. Here you, Aroshka," he added, addressing a poor fellow in a yellow nankeen coat, who considered himself to be a gardener. "What have you to do? Take a stick and sit here, and if anything happens, run to me at once." Aroshka took a stick and sat down on the bottom stair. The crowd dispersed, all except a few inquisitive small boys, while Gavrir went home and sent word through Lyubov Lyubomovna to the mistress that everything had been done, while he sent a postilion for a policeman in case of need. The old lady tied a knot in her handkerchief, sprinkled some eau de cologne on it, sniffed at it, and rubbed her temples with it, drank some tea, and, being still under the influence of the Cherry Bay drops, fell asleep again. An hour after all this hubbub, the garret door opened and Gerasim showed himself. He had on his best coat. He was leading Mumu by a string. Aroshka moved aside and let him pass. Gerasim went to the gates. All the small boys in the yard stared at him in silence. He did not even turn around. He only put his cap on in the street. Gavrir sent the same Aroshka to follow him and keep watch on him as a spy. Aroshka, seeing from a distance that he had gone into a cookshop with his dog, waited for him to come out again. Gerasim was well known at the cookshop, and his signs were understood. He asked for cabbage soup with meat in it, and sat down with his arms on the table. Mumu stood beside his chair, looking calmly at him with her intelligent eyes. Her coat was glossy. One could see she had just been combed down. They brought Gerasim the soup. He crumbled some bread onto it, cut the meat up small, and put the plate on the ground. Mumu began eating in her usual refined way, her little muzzle daintily held so as scarcely to touch her food. Gerasim gazed a long while at her. 2 big tears suddenly rolled from his eyes. One fell on the dog's brow, and the other into the soup. He shaded his face with his hand. Mumu ate up half the plateful and came away from it, licking her lips. Gerasim got up, paid for the soup, and went out, followed by the rather perplexed glances of the waiter. Aroshka, seeing Gerasim, hid round a corner, and letting him get in front, followed him again. Gerasim walked without haste, still holding Mumu by a string. When he got to the corner of the street, he stood still as though reflecting, and suddenly set off with rapid steps to the Crimean ford. On the way he went into the yard of a house, where a lodge was being built, and carried away 2 bricks under his arm. At the Crimean ford, he turned along the bank and went to a place where there were 2 little rowing boats fastened to stakes. He had noticed them there before, and jumped into one of them with Mumu. A lame old man came out of a shed in the corner of a kitchen garden and shouted after him, but Gerasim only nodded and began rowing so vigorously, though against a stream, that in an instant he had darted 200 yards away. The old man stood for a while, scratched his back first with the left and then with the right hand, and went back hobbling to the shed. Gerasim rode on and on. Moscow was soon left behind. Meadows stretched each side of the bank. Market gardens, fields and copses, peasants' huts began to make their appearance. There was the fragrance of the country. He threw down his oars, bent his head down to Mumu, who was sitting facing him on a dry cross seat. The bottom of the boat was full of water, and stayed, motionless, his mighty hands clasped upon her back, while the boat was gradually carried back by the current towards the town. At last, Gerasim drew himself up hurriedly, with a sort of sick anger in his face. He tied up the bricks he had taken with string, made a running noose, put it round Mumu's neck, lifted her up over the river, and, for the last time, looked at her. She watched him confidingly, and without any fear, faintly wagging her tail. He turned away, frowned, and wrung his hands. Gerasim heard nothing. Neither the quick, shrill whine of Mumu as she fell, nor the heavy splash of the water. For him, the noisiest day was soundless and silent, as even the stillest night is not silent to us. When he opened his eyes again, little wavelets were hurrying over the river, chasing one another. As before, they broke against the boat's side, and only far away behind, wide circles moved, widening to the bank. Directly, Gerasim had vanished from Eroshka's sight. The latter returned home and reported what he had seen. "Well then," observed Stepan, "he'll drown her. Now we can feel easy about it. If he promises the thing." No one saw Gerasim during the day. He did not have dinner at home. Evening came on. They were all gathered together to supper, except him. "What a strange creature that Gerasim is," piped a fat laundry maid. "Fancy upsetting himself like that over a dog. Upon my word." "But Gerasim has been here," Stepan cried all at once, scraping up his porridge with a spoon. "How? When?" "Why, a couple of hours ago. Yes, indeed. I ran against him at the gate. He was going out again from here. He was coming out of the yard. I tried to ask him about his dog, but he wasn't in the best of humours, I could see. Well, he gave me a shove. I suppose he only meant to put me out of his way, as if he'd say, 'Let me go, do,' but he fetched me such a crack on my neck, so seriously that, oh!" And Stepan, who could not help laughing, shrugged up and rubbed the back of his head. "Yes," he added, "he has got a fist. It's something like a fist, there's no denying that." They all laughed at Stepan, and after supper they separated to go to bed. Meanwhile, at that very time, a gigantic figure with a bag on his shoulders and a stick in his hand was eagerly and persistently stepping out along the T-high road. It was Gerasim. After drowning poor Mumu, he had run back to his garret, hurriedly packed a few things together in an old horsecloth, tied it up in a bundle, tossed it on his shoulder, and so was ready. He had noticed the road carefully when he was brought to Moscow. The village his mistress had taken him from lay only about 20 miles off the high road. He walked along it with a sort of invincible purpose, a desperate and at the same time joyous determination. He walked, his shoulders thrown back and his chest expanded. His eyes were fixed greedily straight before him. He hastened as though his old mother were waiting for him at home, as though she were calling to him after her long wanderings in strange parts among strangers. The summer night that was just drawing in was still and warm. On one side, where the sun had set, the horizon was still light and faintly flushed with the last glow of the vanished day, and on the other side a blue-grey twilight had already risen up. The night was coming up from that quarter. Quails were in hundreds around. Corncrakes were calling to one another in the thickets. Gerasim could not hear them. He could not hear the delicate night whisperings of the trees, by which his strong legs carried him, but he smelt the familiar scent of the ripening rye, which was wafted from the dark fields. He felt the wind flying to meet him, the wind from home, beat caressingly upon his face, and play with his hair and his beard. He saw before him the whitening road homewards, straight as an arrow. He saw in the sky stars innumerable, lighting up his way, and stepped out strong and bold as a lion, so that when the rising sun shed its moist, rosy light upon the still fresh and unwearied traveller, already 30 miles lay between him and Moscow. In a couple of days he was at home, in his little hut, to the great astonishment of the soldier's wife who had been put in there. After praying before the holy pictures, He set off at once to the village elder. The village elder was at first surprised, but the hay-cutting had just begun. Gerasim was a first-rate mower, and they put a scythe into his hand on the spot, and he went to mow in his old way, moving so that the peasants were fairly astounded as they watched his wide, sweeping strokes and the heaps he raked together. In Moscow, the day after Gerasim's flight, they missed him. They went to his garret, rummaged about in it, and spoke to Gavrir. He came, looked, shrugged his shoulders, and decided that the dumb man had either run away or had drowned himself with his stupid dog. They gave information to the police and informed the lady. The old lady was furious, burst into tears, gave orders that he was to be found whatever happened, declared that she had never ordered the dog to be destroyed, and in fact gave Gavrir such a rating that he could do nothing all day but shake his head and murmur, "Well," until Uncle Tell checked him at last, sympathetically echoing, "Well." At last, the news came from the country of Gerasim's being there. The old lady was somewhat pacified. At first, she issued a mandate for him to be brought back without delay to Moscow. Afterwards, however, she declared that such an ungrateful creature was absolutely of no use to her. Soon after this, she died herself, and her heirs had no thought to spare for Gerasim. They let their mother's other servants redeem their freedom on payment of an annual rent. And Gerasim is living still, a lonely man in his lonely hut. He is strong and healthy as before, and does the work of 4 men as before, and as before is serious and steady. But his neighbours have observed that ever since his return from Moscow he has quite given up the society of women. He will not even look at them, and does not keep even a single dog. It's his good luck, though, the peasants reason, that he can get on without female folk, and as for a dog, what need has he of a dog? You wouldn't get a thief to go into his yard for any money. Such is the fame of the dumb man's titanic strength. Thank you for listening to Mumu by Ivan Turgenev.
Kashtanka by Anton Chekhov, narrated by Peter Coates. Chapter 1. Misbehaviour. A young dog, a reddish mongrel between a dachshund and a yard dog, very like a fox in face, was running up and down the pavement looking uneasily from side to side. From time to time she stopped, and, whining and lifting first one chilled paw and then another, tried to make up her mind how it could have happened that she was lost. She remembered very well how she had passed the day, and how, in the end, she had found herself on this unfamiliar pavement. The day had begun by her master, Luka Alexandrich's, putting on his hat, taking something wooden under his arm wrapped up in a red handkerchief and calling, "Kashtanka, come along." Hearing her name, the mongrel had come out from under the work-table, where she slept on the shavings, stretched herself voluptuously and ran after her master. The people Luka Alexandrich worked for lived a very long way off, so that before he could get to any one of them, the carpenter had several times to step into a tavern to fortify himself. Kashtanka remembered that on the way she had behaved extremely improperly. In her delight that she was being taken for a walk, she jumped about, dashed barking after the trains, ran into yards, and chased other dogs. The carpenter was continually losing sight of her, stopping and angrily shouting at her. Once he had even, with an expression of fury in his face, taken her fox-like ear in his fist, smacked her, and said emphatically, "Plague take you, you pest!" After having left the work where it had been bespoken, Luka Alexandrich went into his sister's and there had something to eat and drink. From his sister's he had gone to see a bookbinder he knew, from the bookbinder's to a tavern, from the tavern to another crony's, and so on. In short, by the time Kashtanka found herself on the unfamiliar pavement, it was getting dusk, and the carpenter was as drunk as a cobbler. He was waving his arms and, breathing heavily, muttered, "In sin my mother bore me. Ah, sins, sins! Here now we are walking along the street and looking at the street lamps, but when we die we shall burn in a fiery Gehenna." Or he fell into a good-natured tone, called Kashtanka to him, and said to her, "You, Kashtanka, are an insect of a creature and nothing else. Beside a man you are much the same as a joiner beside a cabinet-maker." While he talked to her in that way, there was suddenly a burst of music. Kashtanka looked round and saw that a regiment of soldiers was coming straight towards her. Unable to endure the music, which unhinged her nerves, she turned round and wailed. To her great surprise, the carpenter, instead of being frightened, whining and barking, gave a broad grin, drew himself up to attention, and saluted with all his 5 fingers. Seeing that her master did not protest, Kashtanka whined louder than ever, and dashed across the road to the opposite pavement. When she recovered herself, the band was not playing, and the regiment was no longer there. She ran across the road to the spot where she had left her master, but alas, the carpenter was no longer there. She dashed forward, then back again, and ran across the road once more, but the carpenter seemed to have vanished into the earth. Kashtanka began sniffing the pavement, hoping to find her master by the scent of his tracks, but some wretch had been that way just before in new rubber galoshes, and now all delicate scents were mixed with an acute stench of India rubber, so that it was impossible to make out anything. Kashtanka ran up and down and did not find her master, and meanwhile it had got dark. The street lamps were lighted on both sides of the road, and lights appeared in the windows. Big, fluffy snowflakes were falling and painting white the pavement, the horses' backs and the cabmen's caps, and the darker the evening grew, the whiter were all these objects. Unknown customers kept walking incessantly to and fro, obstructing her field of vision and shoving against her with their feet. All mankind Kashtanka divided into 2 uneven parts, masters and customers. Between them there was an essential difference. The first had the right to beat her, and the second she had the right to nip by the calves of their legs. These customers were hurrying off somewhere and paid no attention to her. When it got quite dark, Kashtanka was overcome by despair and horror. She huddled up in an entrance and began whining piteously. The long day's journeying with Luka Alexandrich had exhausted her. Her ears and her paws were freezing, and what was more, she was terribly hungry. Only twice in the whole day had she tasted a morsel. She had eaten a little paste at the bookbinder's, and in one of the taverns she had found a sausage skin on the floor, near the counter. That was all. If she had been a human being, she would have certainly thought, "No, it is impossible to live like this. I must shoot myself." Chapter 2. A Mysterious Stranger. But she thought of nothing. She simply whined. When her head and back were entirely plastered over with the soft feathery snow, and she had sunk into a painful doze of exhaustion, all at once the door of the entrance clicked, creaked, and struck her on the side. She jumped up. A man belonging to the class of customers came out. As Kashtanka whined and got under his feet, he could not help noticing her. He bent down to her and asked, "Doggy, where do you come from? Have I hurt you? Oh, poor thing, poor thing. Come, don't be cross, don't be cross. I'm sorry." Kashtanka looked at the stranger through the snowflakes that hung on her eyelashes, and saw before her a short, fat little man with a plump, shaven face, wearing a top hat and a fur coat that swung open. "Why are you whining for?" he went on, knocking the snow off her back with his fingers. "Where is your master? I suppose you are lost. Ah, poor doggy, what are we going to do now?" Catching in the stranger's voice a warm, cordial note, Kashtanka licked his hand and whined still more pitifully. "Oh, you nice funny thing," said the stranger. "A regular fox. Well, there's nothing for it. You must come along with me. Perhaps you will be of use for something. Well." He clicked with his lips and made a sign to Kashtanka with his hand, which could only mean one thing: "Come along." Kashtanka went. Not more than half an hour later, she was sitting on the floor in a big, light room, and leaning her head against her side, was looking with tenderness and curiosity at the stranger who was sitting at the table, dining. He ate and threw pieces to her. At first he gave her bread and the green rind of a cheese, then a piece of meat, half a pie and chicken bones, while through hunger she ate so quickly that she had not time to distinguish the taste, and the more she ate, the more acute was the feeling of hunger. "Your masters don't feed you properly," said the stranger, seeing with what ferocious greediness she swallowed the morsels without munching them. "And how thin you are! Nothing but skin and bones." Kashtanka ate a great deal and yet did not satisfy her hunger, but was simply stupefied with eating. After dinner she lay down in the middle of the room, stretched her legs, and, conscious of an agreeable weariness all over her body, wagged her tail. While her new master, lounging in an easy-chair, smoked a cigar, she wagged her tail and considered the question whether it was better at the stranger's or at the carpenter's. The stranger's surroundings were poor and ugly. Besides the easy-chairs, the sofa, the lamps, and the rugs, there was nothing, and the room seemed empty. At the carpenter's the whole place was stuffed full of things. He had a table, a bench, a heap of shavings, planes, chisels, saws, a cage with a goldfinch, a basin. The stranger's room smelt of nothing, while there was always a thick fog in the carpenter's room, and a glorious smell of glue, varnish, and shavings. On the other hand, the stranger had one great superiority. He gave her a great deal to eat, and, to do him full justice, when Kashtanka sat facing the table and looking wistfully at him, he did not once hit or kick her, and did not once shout, "Go away, damn brute!" When he had finished his cigar, her new master went out, and a minute later came back, holding a little mattress in his hands. "Hey, you dog, come here," he said, laying the mattress in the corner near the dog. "Lie down here. Go to sleep." Then he put out the lamp and went away. Kashtanka lay down on the mattress and shut her eyes. The sound of a bark rose from the street, and she would have liked to answer it, but all at once she was overcome with unexpected melancholy. She thought of Luka Alexandritch, of his son Fedyushka, and her snug little place under the bench. She remembered on the long winter evenings, when the carpenter was planning or reading the paper aloud, Fedyushka usually played with her. He used to pull her from under the bench by her hind legs and play such tricks with her that she saw green before her eyes and ached in every joint. He would make her walk on her hind legs, use her as a bell, that is, shake her violently by the tail so that she squealed and barked, and gave her tobacco to sniff. The following trick was particularly agonizing. Fedyushka would tie a piece of meat to a thread and give it to Kashtanka, and then, when she had swallowed it, he would, with a loud laugh, pull it back again from her stomach, and the more lurid were her memories, the more loudly and miserably Kashtanka whined. But soon exhaustion and warmth prevailed over melancholy. She began to fall asleep. Dogs ran by in her imagination, among them a shaggy old poodle, whom she had seen that day in the street with a white patch on his eye and tufts of wool by his nose. Fedyushka ran after the poodle with a chisel in his hand. Then all at once he too was covered with shaggy wool, and began merrily barking beside Kashtanka. Kashtanka and he good-naturedly sniffed each other's noses, and merrily ran down the street. Chapter 3. New and Very Agreeable Acquaintances. When Kashtanka woke up, it was already light, and a sound rose from the street, such as only comes in the daytime. There was not a soul in the room. Kashtanka stretched, yawned, and, cross and ill-humoured, walked about the room. She sniffed the corners and the furniture, looked into the passage and found nothing of interest there. Besides the door that led into the passage, there was another door. After thinking a little, Kashtanka scratched on it with both paws, opened it, and went into the adjoining room. Here on the bed, covered with a rug, a customer, in whom she recognized the stranger of yesterday, lay asleep. "Grrr," she growled, but recollecting yesterday's dinner, wagged her tail and began sniffing. She sniffed the stranger's clothes and boots, and thought they smelt of horses. In the bedroom was another door, also closed. Kashtanka scratched at the door, leaned her chest against it, opened it, and was instantly aware of a strange and very suspicious smell. Foreseeing an unpleasant encounter, growling and looking about her, Kashtanka walked into a little room with a dirty wallpaper and drew back in alarm. She saw something surprising and terrible. A grey gander came straight towards her, hissing, with its neck bowed down to the floor and its wings outspread. Not far from him, on a little mattress, lay a white tomcat. Seeing Kashtanka, he jumped up, arched his back, wagged his tail with his hair standing on end, and he too hissed at her. The dog was frightened in earnest, but not caring to betray her alarm, began barking loudly and dashed at the cat. The cat arched his back more than ever, mewed, and gave Kashtanka a smack on the head with his paw. Kashtanka jumped back, squatted on all four paws, and, craning her nose towards the cat, went off into loud, shrill barks. Meanwhile the gander came up behind and gave her a painful peck in the back. Kashtanka leapt up and dashed at the gander. "What's this?" they heard a loud, angry voice, and the stranger came into the room in his dressing-gown, with a cigar between his teeth. "What's the meaning of this? To your places." He went up to the cat, flicked him on his arched back, and said, "Fyodor Timofeyich, what is the meaning of this? Have you got up a fight? Ah, you old rascal, lie down." And turning to the gander, he shouted, "Ivan Ivanitch, go home." The cat obediently lay down on his mattress and closed his eyes. Judging from the expression of his face and whiskers, he was displeased with himself for having lost his temper and got into a fight. Kashtanka began whining resentfully, while the gander craned his neck and began saying something rapidly, excitedly, distinctly, but quite unintelligibly. All right, said his master, yawning. "You must live in peace and friendship." He stroked Kashtanka and went on, "And you, red hair, don't be frightened. They are capital company. They won't annoy you. Stay, what are we to call you? You can't go on without a name, my dear." The stranger thought a moment and said, "I tell you what, you shall be Auntie. Do you understand? Auntie." And repeating the word auntie several times, he went out. Kashtanka sat down and began watching. The cat sat motionless on his little mattress and pretended to be asleep. The gander, craning his neck and stamping, went on talking rapidly and excitedly about something. Apparently it was a very clever gander. After every long tirade, he always stepped back with an air of wonder and made a show of being highly delighted with his own speech. Listening to him and answering, "Rrrr," Kashtanka fell to sniffing the corners. In one of the corners she found a little trough, in which she saw some soaked peas and a sop of rye crusts. She tried the peas. They were not nice. She tried the sopped bread and began eating it. The gander was not at all offended that the strange dog was eating his food, but, on the contrary, talked even more excitedly, and to show his confidence went to the trough and ate a few peas himself. Chapter 4. Marvels on a Hurdle. A little while afterwards the stranger came in again, and brought a strange thing with him like a hurdle, or like the Roman figure 2. On the crosspiece on the top of this roughly made wooden frame hung a bell, and a pistol was also tied to it. There were strings from the tongue of the bell and the trigger of the pistol. The stranger put the frame in the middle of the room, spent a long time tying and untying something, then looked at the gander and said, "Ivan Ivanitch, if you please." The gander went up to him and stood in an expectant attitude. "Now then," said the stranger, "let us begin at the very beginning. First of all, bow and make a curtsy. Look sharp." Ivan Ivanitch craned his neck, nodded in all directions, and scraped with his foot. "Right, bravo! Now die." The gander lay on his back and stuck his legs in the air. After performing a few more similar unimportant tricks, the stranger suddenly clutched at his head and, assuming an expression of horror, shouted, "Help! Fire! We are burning!" Ivan Ivanitch ran to the frame, took the string in his beak, and set the bell ringing. The stranger was very much pleased. He stroked the gander's neck and said, "Bravo, Ivan Ivanitch! Now pretend that you are a jeweller selling gold and diamonds. Imagine now that you go to your shop and find thieves there. What would you do in that case?" The gander took the string in his beak and pulled it, and at once a deafening report was heard. Kashtanka was highly delighted with the bell ringing, and the shot threw her into so much ecstasy that she ran round the frame barking. "Auntie, lie down!" cried the stranger. "Be quiet!" Ivan Ivanitch's task was not ended with the shooting. For a whole hour afterwards the stranger drove the gander round him on a cord, cracking a whip, and the gander had to jump over barriers and through hoops. He had to rear, that is, sit on his tail and wave his legs in the air. Kashtanka could not take her eyes off Ivan Ivanitch, wriggled with delight, and several times fell to running after him with shrill barks. After exhausting the gander and himself, the stranger wiped the sweat from his brow and cried, "Maria, fetch Havronya Ivanovna here." A minute later there was the sound of grunting. Kashtanka growled, assumed a very valiant air, and, to be on the safe side, went nearer to the stranger. The door opened, an old woman looked in and, saying something, led in a black and very ugly sow. Paying no attention to Kashtanka's growls, the sow lifted up her little hoof and grunted good-humouredly. Apparently it was very agreeable to her to see her master, the cat, and Ivan Ivanitch. When she went up to the cat and gave him a light tap on the stomach with her hoof, and then made some remark to the gander, a great deal of good nature was expressed in her movements, and the quivering of her tail. Kashtanka realized at once that to growl and bark at such a character was useless. The master took away the frame and cried, "Fyodor Timofeich, if you please." The cat stretched lazily, and reluctantly, as though performing a duty, went up to the sow. "Come, let us begin with the Egyptian pyramid," began the master. He spent a long time explaining something, then gave the word of command. 1, 2, 3. At the word 3, Ivan Ivanitch flapped his wings and jumped onto the sow's back. When, balancing himself with his wings and his neck, he got a firm foothold on the bristly back, Fyodor Timofeich listlessly and lazily, with manifest disdain, and with an air of scorning his art and not caring a pin for it, climbed onto the sow's back, then reluctantly mounted onto the gander, and stood on his hind legs. The result was what the stranger called the Egyptian pyramid. Kashtanka yapped with delight, but at that moment the old cat yawned and, losing his balance, rolled off the gander. Ivan Ivanitch lurched and fell off too. The stranger shouted, waved his hands, and began explaining something again. After spending an hour over the pyramid, their indefatigable master proceeded to teach Ivan Ivanitch to ride on the cat, then began to teach the cat to smoke, and so on. The lesson ended in the stranger's wiping the sweat off his brow and going away. Fyodor Timofeich gave a disdainful sniff, lay down on his mattress, and closed his eyes. Ivan Ivanitch went to the trough, and the pig was taken away by the old woman. Thanks to the number of her new impressions, Kashtanka hardly noticed how the day passed, and in the evening she was installed with her mattress in the room with the dirty wallpaper, and spent the night in the society of Fyodor Timofeich and the gander. Chapter 5. Talent, Talent. A month passed. Kashtanka had grown used to having a nice dinner every evening and being called Auntie. She had grown used to the stranger too, and to her new companions. Life was comfortable and easy. Every day began in the same way. As a rule, Ivan Ivanitch was the first to wake up, and at once went to Auntie or to the cat, twisting his neck and beginning to talk excitedly and persuasively, but, as before, unintelligibly. Sometimes he would crane up his head in the air and utter a long monologue. At first, Kashtanka thought he talked so much because he was very clever, but after a little time had passed, she lost all her respect for him. When he went up to her with his long speeches, she no longer wagged her tail, but treated him as a tiresome chatterbox, who would not let anyone sleep, and without the slightest ceremony answered him with "Rrrr." Fyodor Timofeich was a gentleman of a very different sort. When he woke he did not utter a sound, did not stir, and did not even open his eyes. He would have been glad not to wake, for, as was evident, he was not greatly in love with life. Nothing interested him. He showed an apathetic and nonchalant attitude to everything. He disdained everything, and even while eating his delicious dinner, sniffed contemptuously. When she woke, Kashtanka began walking about the room and sniffing the corners. She and the cat were the only ones allowed to go all over the flat. The gander had not the right to cross the threshold of the room with the dirty wallpaper, and Havronya Ivanovna lived somewhere in a little outhouse in the yard, and made her appearance only during the lessons. Their master got up late, and immediately after drinking his tea, began teaching them their tricks. Every day the frame, the whip, and the hoop were brought in, and every day almost the same performance took place. The lesson lasted 3 or 4 hours, so that sometimes Fyodor Timofeich was so tired that he staggered about like a drunken man, and Ivan Ivanitch opened his beak and breathed heavily, while their master became red in the face and could not mop the sweat from his brow fast enough. The lesson and the dinner made the day very interesting, but the evenings were tedious. As a rule, their master went off somewhere in the evening and took the cat and the gander with him. Left alone, Auntie lay down on her little mattress and began to feel sad. Melancholy crept on her imperceptibly and took possession of her by degrees, as darkness does of a room. It began with the dogs losing every inclination to bark, to eat, to run about the rooms, and even to look at things. Then vague figures, half dogs, half human beings, with countenances attractive, pleasant, but incomprehensible, would appear in her imagination. When they came, Auntie wagged her tail, and it seemed to her that she had somewhere, at some time, seen them and loved them. And as she dropped to sleep, she always felt that those figures smelt of glue, shavings, and varnish. When she had grown quite used to her new life, and from a thin, long mongrel had changed into a sleek, well-groomed dog, her master looked at her one day before the lesson and said, "It's high time, Auntie, to get to business. You have kicked up your heels in idleness long enough. I want to make an artiste of you. Do you want to be an artiste?" And he began teaching her various accomplishments. At the first lesson he taught her to stand and to walk on her hind legs, which she liked extremely. At the second lesson she had to stand on her hind legs and catch some sugar. After that, in the following lessons, she danced, ran tied to a cord, howled to music, rang the bell, and fired the pistol, and in a month could successfully replace Fyodor Timofeyich in the Egyptian pyramid. She learned very eagerly and was pleased with her own success, running with her tongue out on the cord, leaping through the hoop, and riding on old Fyodor Timofeyich gave her the greatest enjoyment. She accompanied every successful trick with a shrill, delighted bark, while her teacher wondered, was also delighted, and rubbed his hands. "It's a talent, it's a talent," he said. "Unquestionable talent. You will certainly be successful." And Auntie grew so used to the word talent that every time her master pronounced it, she jumped up as if it had been her name. Chapter 6. An Uneasy Night. Auntie had a doggy dream that a porter ran after her with a broom, and she woke up in a fright. It was quite dark and very stuffy in the room. The fleas were biting. Auntie had never been afraid of darkness before, but now, for some reason, she felt frightened and inclined to bark. Her master heaved a loud sigh in the next room, then soon afterwards the sow grunted in her sty, and then all was still again. When one thinks about eating, one's heart grows lighter, and Auntie began thinking how that day she had stolen the leg of a chicken from Fyodor Timofeyich, and had hidden it in the drawing-room, between the cupboard and the wall, where there were a great many spiders' webs and a great deal of dust. Would it not be as well to go now and look whether the chicken leg were still there or not? It was very possible that her master had found it and eaten it, but she must not go out of the room before morning. That was the rule. Auntie shut her eyes to go to sleep as quickly as possible, for she knew by experience that the sooner you go to sleep, the sooner the morning comes. But all at once there was a strange scream not far from her which made her start and jump up on all four legs. It was Ivan Ivanitch, and his cry was not babbling and persuasive as usual, but a wild, shrill, unnatural scream like the squeak of a door opening. Unable to distinguish anything in the darkness, and not understanding what was wrong, Auntie felt still more frightened and growled, "Grrr." Some time passed, as long as it takes to eat a good bone. The scream was not repeated. Little by little, Auntie's uneasiness passed off, and she began to doze. She dreamed of two big black dogs with tufts of last year's coat left on their haunches and sides. They were eating out of a big basin some swill, from which there came a white steam and a most appetizing smell. From time to time they looked round at Auntie, showed their teeth, and growled, "We're not going to give you any." But a peasant in a fur coat ran out of the house and drove them away with a whip. Then Auntie went up to the basin and began eating. But as soon as the peasant went out of the gate, the two black dogs rushed at her growling, and all at once there was again a shrill scream. "Kee! Kee!" cried Ivan Ivanitch. Auntie woke, jumped up, and without leaving her mattress, went off into a yelping bark. It seemed to her that it was not Ivan Ivanitch that was screaming, but someone else, and for some reason the sow again grunted in her sty. Then there was the sound of shuffling slippers, and the master came into the room in his dressing-gown with a candle in his hand. The flickering light danced over the dirty wallpaper and the ceiling, and chased away the darkness. Auntie saw that there was no stranger in the room. Ivan Ivanitch was sitting on the floor and was not asleep. His wings were spread out and his beak was open, and altogether he looked as though he were very tired and thirsty. Old Fyodor Timofeyich was not asleep either. He too must have been awakened by the scream. "Ivan Ivanitch, what's the matter with you?" the master asked the gander. "Why are you screaming? Are you ill?" The gander did not answer. The master touched him on the neck, stroked his back, and said, "You are a queer chap. You don't sleep yourself, and you don't let other people." When the master went out, carrying the candle with him, there was darkness again. Auntie felt frightened. The gander did not scream, but again she fancied that there was some stranger in the room. What was most terrible was that this stranger could not be bitten, as he was unseen and had no shape. And for some reason she thought that something very bad would certainly happen that night. Fyodor Timofeich was uneasy too. Auntie could hear him shifting on his mattress, yawning and shaking his head. Somewhere in the street there was a knocking at a gate, and the sow grunted in her sty. Auntie began to whine, stretched out her front paws and laid her head down upon them. She fancied that in the knocking at the gate, in the grunting of the sow, who was for some reason awake, in the darkness and the stillness, there was something as miserable and dreadful as in Ivan Ivanitch's scream. Everything was in agitation and anxiety. But why? Who was the stranger who could not be seen? Then 2 dim flashes of green gleamed for a minute near Auntie. It was Fyodor Timofeich, for the first time of their whole acquaintance, coming up to her. What did he want? Auntie licked his paw, and, not asking why he had come, howled softly and on various notes. "Gee!" cried Ivan Ivanitch. "Gee!" The door opened again, and the master came in with a candle. The gander was sitting in the same attitude as before, with his beak open and his wings spread out. His eyes were closed. "Ivan Ivanitch?" his master called him. The gander did not stir. His master sat down before him on the floor, looked at him in silence for a minute, and said, "Ivan Ivanitch, what is it? Are you dying? Oh, I remember now, I remember!" He cried out and clutched at his head. "I know why it is. It's because the horse stepped on you today. My God! My God!" Auntie did not understand what her master was saying, but she saw from his face that he, too, was expecting something dreadful. She stretched out her head towards the dark window, where it seemed to her some stranger was looking in, and howled. "He is dying, Auntie," said her master, and wrung his hands. Yes, he is dying. Death has come into your room. What are we to do?" Pale and agitated, the master went back into his room, sighing and shaking his head. Auntie was afraid to remain in the darkness, and followed her master into his bedroom. He sat down on the bed and repeated several times, "My God, what's to be done?" Auntie walked about round his feet, and not understanding why she was wretched, and why they were all so uneasy, and trying to understand, watched every movement he made. Fyodor Timofeich, who rarely left his little mattress, came into the master's bedroom too, and began rubbing himself against his feet. He shook his head as though he wanted to shake painful thoughts out of it, and kept peeping suspiciously under the bed. The master took a saucer, poured some water from his washstand into it, and went to the gander again. "Drink, Ivan Ivanitch," he said tenderly, setting the saucer before him. "Drink, darling." But Ivan Ivanitch did not stir and did not open his eyes. His master bent his head down to the saucer and dipped his beak into the water, but the gander did not drink. He spread his wings wider than ever, and his head remained lying in the saucer. "No, there's nothing to be done now," sighed his master. "It's all over. Ivan Ivanitch is gone." and shining drops, such as one sees on the window pane when it rains, trickled down his cheeks. Not understanding what was the matter, Auntie and Fyodor Timofeich snuggled up to him and looked with horror at the gander. "Poor Ivan Ivanitch," said the master, sighing mournfully, "and I was dreaming I would take you in the spring into the country, and would walk with you on the green grass. Dear creature, my good comrade, you are no more. How shall I do without you now?" It seemed to Auntie that the same thing would happen to her. That is, that she too, there was no knowing why, would close her eyes, stretch out her paws, open her mouth, and everyone would look at her with horror. Apparently the same reflections were passing through the brain of Fyodor Timofeich. Never before had the old cat been so morose and gloomy. It began to get light, and the unseen stranger who had so frightened Auntie was no longer in the room. When it was quite daylight, the porter came in, took the gander, and carried him away, and soon afterwards the old woman came in and took away the trough. Auntie went into the drawing-room and looked behind the cupboard. Her master had not eaten the chicken bone. It was lying in its place among the dust and spiders' webs. But Auntie felt sad and dreary, and wanted to cry. She did not even sniff at the bone, but went under the sofa, sat down there, and began softly whining in a thin voice. Chapter 7. An Unsuccessful Debut. One fine evening the master came into the room with the dirty wallpaper, and rubbing his hands said, "Well?" He meant to say something more, but went away without saying it. Auntie, who during her lessons had thoroughly studied his face and intonations, divined that he was agitated, anxious, and she fancied angry. Soon afterwards he came back and said, "Today I shall take with me Auntie and Fyodor Timofeich. Today, Auntie, you will take the place of poor Ivan Ivanitch in the Egyptian pyramid. Goodness knows how it will be. Nothing is ready. Nothing has been thoroughly studied. There have been few rehearsals. We shall be disgraced. We shall come to grief." Then he went out again, and a minute later came back in his fur coat and top hat. Going up to the cat, he took him by the forepaws and put him inside the front of his coat, while Fyodor Timofeich appeared completely unconcerned, and did not even trouble to open his eyes. To him it was apparently a matter of absolute indifference whether he remained lying down or were lifted up by his paws, whether he rested on his mattress or under his master's fur coat. "Come along, Auntie," said her master. Wagging her tail and understanding nothing, Auntie followed him. A minute later she was sitting in a sledge by her master's feet, and heard him, shrinking with cold and anxiety, mutter to himself, "We shall be disgraced. We shall come to grief." The sledge stopped at a big strange-looking house, like a soup ladle turned upside down. The long entrance to this house, with its 3 glass doors, was lighted up with a dozen brilliant lamps. The doors opened with a resounding noise, and, like jaws, swallowed up the people who were moving to and fro at the entrance. There were a great many people. Horses, too, often ran up to the entrance, but no dogs were to be seen. The master took Auntie in his arms and thrust her in his coat, where Fyodor Timofeich already was. It was dark and stuffy there, but warm. For an instant the 2 green sparks flashed at her. It was the cat, who opened his eyes on being disturbed by his neighbour's cold, rough paws. Auntie licked his ear, and trying to settle herself as comfortably as possible, moved uneasily, crushed him under her cold paws, and casually poked her head out from under the coat, but at once growled angrily and tucked it in again. It seemed to her that she had seen a huge, badly lighted room, full of monsters, from behind screens and gratings, which stretched out on both sides of the room. Horrible faces looked out, faces of horses with horns, with long ears, and one fat, huge countenance, with a tail instead of a nose, and two long gnawed bones sticking out of his mouth. The cat mewed huskily under Auntie's paws, but at that moment the coat was flung open, the master said, "Hop," and Fyodor Timofeyitch and Auntie jumped to the floor. They were now in a little room with grey plank walls. There was no other furniture in it but a little table with a looking-glass on it, a stool and some rags hung about the corners, and instead of a lamp or candles, there was a bright fan-shaped light attached to a little pipe fixed in the wall. Fyodor Timofeyitch licked his coat, which had been ruffled by Auntie, went under the stool and laid down. Their master, still agitated and rubbing his hands, began undressing. He undressed as he usually did at home when he was preparing to get under the rug, that is, took off everything but his underlinen. Then he sat down on the stool, and looking in the looking-glass, began playing the most surprising tricks with himself. First of all he put on his head a wig, with a parting and two tufts of hair standing up like horns. Then he smeared his face thickly with something white, and over the white colour painted his eyebrows, his moustaches, and red on his cheeks. His antics did not end with that. After smearing his face and neck, he began putting himself into an extraordinary and incongruous costume, such as Auntie had never seen before, either in houses or in the street. Imagine very full trousers, made of chintz covered with big flowers, such as is used in working-class houses for curtains and covering furniture. Trousers which buttoned up just under his armpits. One trouser leg was made of brown chintz, the other of bright yellow. Almost lost in these, he then put on a short chintz jacket with a big scalloped collar and a gold star on the back, stockings of different colours, and green slippers. Everything seemed going round before Auntie's eyes and in her soul. The white-faced, sack-like figure smelt like her master. Its voice, too, was the familiar master's voice. But there were moments when Auntie was tortured by doubts, and then she was ready to run away from the party-coloured figure and to bark. The new place, the fan-shaped light, the smell, the transformation that had taken place in her master, all this aroused in her a vague dread and a foreboding that she would certainly meet with some horror, such as the big face with the tail instead of a nose. And then, somewhere through the wall, some hateful band was playing, and from time to time she heard an incomprehensible roar. Only one thing reassured her. That was the imperturbability of Fyodor Timofeyitch. He dozed with the utmost tranquillity under the stool, and did not open his eyes even when it was moved. A man in a dress coat and a white waistcoat peeped into the little room and said, "Miss Arabella has just gone on. After her, you." Their master made no answer. He drew a small box from under the table, sat down and waited. From his lips and his hands it could be seen that he was agitated, and Auntie could hear how his breathing came in gasps. "Monsieur George, come on!" someone shouted behind the door. Their master got up and crossed himself 3 times, then took the cat from under the stool and put him in the box. "Come, Auntie," he said softly. Auntie, who could make nothing out of it, went up to his hands. He kissed her on the head and put her beside Fyodor Timofeyitch. Then followed darkness. Auntie trampled on the cat, scratched at the walls of the box, and was so frightened that she could not utter a sound, while the box swayed and quivered as though it were on the waves. "Here we are again!" her master shouted aloud. "Here we are again!" Auntie felt that after that shout the box struck against something hard and left off swaying. There was a loud, deep roar. Someone was being slapped, and that someone, probably the monster with the tail instead of a nose, roared and laughed so loud that the locks of the box trembled. In response to the roar, there came a shrill, squeaky laugh from her master, such as he never laughed at home. "Ah!" he shouted, trying to shout above the roar. "Honoured friends, I have only just come from the station. My granny's kicked the bucket and left me a fortune. There is something very heavy in this box. It must be gold. Ha ha ha! I bet there's $1 million here. We'll open it and look." The lock of the box clicked. The bright light dazzled Auntie's eyes. She jumped out of the box and, deafened by the roar, ran quickly round her master and broke into a shrill bark. "Ha!" exclaimed her master. "Uncle Fyodor Timofeich, beloved aunt, dear relations, the devil take you." He fell on his stomach on the sand, seized the cat and Auntie, and fell to embracing them. While he held Auntie tight in his arms, she glanced round into the world in which fate had brought her, and, impressed by its immensity, was for a minute dumbfounded with amazement and delight, then jumped out of her master's arms, and to express the intensity of her emotions, whirled round and round on one spot like a top. This new world was big and full of bright light. Wherever she looked, on all sides, from floor to ceiling, there were faces, 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 and nothing else. "Auntie, I beg you to sit down," shouted her master. Remembering what that meant, Auntie jumped onto a chair and sat down. She looked at her master. His eyes looked at her gravely and kindly as always, but his face, especially his mouth and teeth, were made grotesque by a broad, immovable grin. He laughed, skipped about, twitched his shoulders, and made a show of being very merry in the presence of the thousands of faces. Auntie believed in his merriment, all at once felt all over her that those thousands of faces were looking at her, lifted up her fox-like head, and howled joyously. "You sit there, Auntie," her master said to her, "while Uncle and I will dance the Kamarinsky." Fyodor Timofeich stood looking about him indifferently, waiting to be made to do something silly. He danced listlessly, carelessly, sullenly, and one could see from his movements, his tail and his ears, that he had a profound contempt for the crowd, the bright light, his master, and himself. When he had performed his allotted task, he gave a yawn and sat down. "Now, Auntie," said her master, "we'll have first a song and then a dance, shall we?" He took a pipe out of his pocket and began playing. Auntie, who could not endure music, began moving uneasily in her chair and howled. A roar of applause rose from all sides. Her master bowed, and when all was still again, went on playing. Just as he took one very high note, someone high up among the audience uttered a loud exclamation. "Auntie!" cried a child's voice. "Why, it's Kashtanka!" "Kashtanka it is!" declared a cracked, drunken tenor. "Kashtanka! Strike me dead, Fedushka! It is Kashtanka! Kashtanka! Here!" Someone in the gallery gave a whistle, and two voices, one a boy's and one a man's, called loudly, "Kashtanka! Kashtanka!" Auntie started and looked where the shouting came from. Two faces, one hairy, drunken and grinning, the other chubby, rosy-cheeked and frightened-looking, dazed her eyes as the bright light had dazed them before. She remembered, fell off the chair, struggled on the sand, then jumped up and with a delighted yap dashed towards those faces. There was a deafening roar, interspersed with whistles and a shrill childish shout, "Kashtanka! Kashtanka!" Auntie leaped over the barrier, then across someone's shoulders. She found herself in a box. To get into the next tier she had to leap over a high wall. Auntie jumped, but did not jump high enough and slipped back down the wall. Then she was passed from hand to hand, licked hands and faces, kept mounting higher and higher, and at last got into the gallery. Half an hour afterwards, Kashtanka was in the street, following the people who smelt of glue and varnish. Luka Alexandrovich staggered and, instinctively taught by experience, tried to keep as far from the gutter as possible. "In my sin my mother bore me," he muttered, "and you, Kashtanka, are a thing of little understanding. Beside a man you are like a joiner beside a cabinet-maker." Fedyushka walked beside him, wearing his father's cap. Kashtanka looked at their backs, and it seemed to her that she had been following them for ages, and was glad that there had not been a break for a minute in her life. She remembered the little room with dirty wallpaper, the gander, Fyodor Timofeyitch, the delicious dinners, the lessons, the circus, but all that seemed to her now like a long, tangled, oppressive dream. The end. Thank you for listening to Kashtanka by Anton Chekhov, narrated by Peter.
The Lion and the Puppy. There was once a zoo in London that took stray cats and dogs to feed its animals. One time, a visitor to the zoo picked up a puppy from the street and took it along with him. Handing it over at the gate, he watched the keeper throw the hapless puppy into the lion's cage. Poor little dog. Tail between its legs, it squeezed itself into the corner of the cage as the lion came closer and closer. Suddenly the lion stopped and began to sniff his victim. Tickled by the lion's whiskers, the puppy rolled over and wagged its tail playfully. At that, the lion prodded it uncertainly, with his paw pushing it to and fro over the floor of his cage. To the lion's surprise, the little dog nimbly jumped up and stood on its hind legs, begging. Puzzled, the lion stared at the dog, shifting his massive head slowly from side to side, not knowing what to make of this funny little animal. But he let it be. At feeding time, when the keeper tossed meat into the cage, the lion tore off a piece for the puppy. And at sunset, as the lion lay down to sleep, the puppy lay alongside him, resting its tiny head on the lion's great paws. From that day on, the lion and the puppy lived together in the same cage, the lion sharing his food, never harming his companion, sleeping alongside and now and then playing with it. Then one day a fine gentleman visited the zoo and straightway recognized his long-lost pet. The keeper was informed and of course would willingly have handed it over had not the lion raged and roared every time he approached the puppy. In the end he gave up, and the gentleman had to go home empty-handed. So the lion and the puppy stayed together. Thus it continued for a whole year, until one day the little dog fell sick, and in a short space of time he died. What a change came over the lion. All the while he licked and sniffed his friend, prodding it with his paw. At last, realizing it was indeed dead, the lion sprang up, his mane quivering with rage. He stalked about the cage, swinging his tail fiercely. He flung himself against the iron bars and tore at the wooden floorboards. All day long he roared in his anguish, until finally he sank down beside his dead companion, and he was quiet. But when the keeper tried to remove the dead puppy, the lion growled menacingly and would not let him near. After a while, the keeper had an idea. Thinking a new puppy would make the lion forget his grief, he thrust another dog between the bars. But the lion ignored the puppy. Then, gently, he put his paws about his cold little friend and lay grieving for a full 5 days. And on the 6th day, the lion died. The end.